Getting started, I decided to use plywood laminations for the main structure of this bench. I ripped a bunch of scrap 3/4 inch plywood that I had kicking around into 3-inch strips for the leg assemblies. The plywood I'm using is cabinet grade birch, but honestly it's not the best plywood I've ever used. There's a good amount of bow to the sheets and plenty of voids in the ply. It would be more aesthetically pleasing to use Baltic birch for this, but I wanted to keep the cost down and use a bunch of material that I had on site. Once I got all the strips ripped down, I hopped over to the miter saw and cut them down to about 34 inches long. This is longer than I needed, but we'll be trimming them down to the final length once they are glued up. Now that I have all of these 3-inch strips, I lay out where I want the center 2 pieces to land on the outside pieces. I'm going to glue these together to create a saddle of sorts for the long stretchers to land in. That might not make a ton of sense right now, but watch along and you'll see what I'm up to. After test fitting with a 3-inch scrap, I apply a liberal amount of glue to the connecting faces on all 4 pieces. I thought it would be easier to glue these up in halves and then glue them together. I use a couple of brad nails to keep the glued pieces from sliding around. When gluing up pieces like this, it's important to ensure they're all aligned properly. Any small misalignment now will be corrected after the glue dries, but we want to keep this as tight as possible. I like to use a straight edge to check the alignment and make minor adjustments as needed. Also, using enough clamps and proper clamping pressure helps to avoid gaps in the lamination. It's always satisfying to see a bunch of scrap wood turn into something useful and sturdy. Moving on to the main stretchers that make up the main part of the table structure, I rip a bunch more 3-inch strips. I decided that laminating 2 of these together would be enough for the amount of weight this table will carry. Given that there are 3 legs across the front and 3 across the back, and the overall dimensions are around 7 feet wide, it seems plenty strong. After ripping all of the strips off of an 8-foot sheet, I liberally applied glue to each side and smushed them together. Rather than clamping these up, I used a bunch of 1.25-inch cabinet screws to suck them tight. These cabinet screws are self-drilling, so I find I don't need to pre-drill when using plywood. If you're using hardwood for this, you would want to make sure that you pre-drill so that you don't split the wood. I double check the measurements of my saw, then move over to the miter saw to chop these to length. I probably should have triple checked as the table ended up a hair wider than I would have wanted, but we'll talk about that later. Moving back to the legs, I needed to square these up. They were pretty close, but the pieces shifted a little bit during the glue up. This would have been the perfect task for a jointer, but alas, I still don't have one. I used a level as a straight edge and ran one side through the table saw. I then flipped the legs over and used the fence to square up the other side. I then used the miter saw to cut the legs to their final length. Squaring up large pieces like this can be tricky without the right equipment, but with patience and careful execution, it's definitely doable. If you're in a similar situation, just take your time and go slow and you can make these cuts accurately and safely. The position of the legs for my bench might be a little unique. I need to leave around 12 inches on the side next to the wall to clear the dust pipe and blast gates. I laid out my legs with one at the corner, one in the middle, and one set in around 12 inches. This also works out well for the spacing of the drawers I plan to build into the bench. I felt that the overhang would be sturdy enough given that this side is against the wall and won't see a ton of heavy use. To build the leg assemblies, I filled the leg saddles with glue and wiped it on all sides. I then pushed the stretchers in and squared everything up with a speed square. I put in one brad nail, rechecked everything for square, and then put in another brad. These keep the legs from shifting while I sink in a few screws. And that's it. I just repeat this for 6 legs and we're all set. When assembling pieces like this, it is crucial to ensure that everything is square. Using a speed square or framing square can really help you dial in that precise angle, which is especially important for a project like this where errors can compound. I had an idea for how far off the ground I needed the bottom of the table to be to clear the ducting. I figured it would be best to clean everything out and set up the legs to get a visual reference for how it would best come together. Turns out I do keep a lot of crap under those sawhorses and in behind my table. And believe it or not, a lot of dust accumulates in places you can't see. I got everything cleaned up and then set up the legs where I wanted them to see where the bottom stretchers would be. There's no fancy joinery here. I just used some glue and screws to attach them to the leg assemblies. These will basically only have to carry the weight of the sheet of plywood I'm putting on, so I'm confident this will be strong enough. Then it's just repeat on the other side and we're off to the races. I ordered these adjustable leveling feet from Amazon. They're pretty simple and pretty cost effective and have a stated weight capacity of 330 pounds per foot. To install, I mark the center of each leg and then I drill a 1/2 inch hole slightly deeper than the bolt on the foot. Then you just pound in this little T-nut thingy into the leg and attach it with 3 screws provided. Then just thread in the foot and you're all set. I was worried that they would be unstable and that the table would wobble, but after I got everything leveled, the table doesn't move at all. I can still drag it on the concrete floor if I try, but it won't move at all under regular use. If you're interested, I put a link to these feet in the description below. Leveling a workbench is critical, especially if your floor is uneven. These adjustable feet make the process a lot easier and ensure that your bench will be stable no matter what. On every YouTube video you see where someone builds an assembly table or an outfeed table, they inevitably complain about having to build a table without a table. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to let you watch me struggle to rip down these sheets into even more 3-inch strips. I enlisted the help of my wife for this, and we can all watch together and wonder why I didn't just do this on the ground with my track saw like a normal person would. With only a few terrifying sounds coming out of my table saw, we managed to get it done. Then, back once again to the miter saw to cut these to length. For the record, I have been firmly in the camp of people that don't think a miter saw is required in a woodworking shop. I will say though that I use it an awful lot, and it really is convenient when working with longer materials. I wouldn't be able to move 8-foot wide pieces like this through my table saw on a crosscut sled without reorganizing half my shop or maybe just moving the table saw outside. On the off chance that my brother is watching this and makes it this far, you were right, Stu. Miter saws are okay. I drilled 2 pocket holes into each side of these stringers to attach them to the tops and bottoms of the leg assemblies. This was pretty straightforward. After drilling all the holes, I used a long clamp to hold up the leg assemblies and pull them together. Pocket screws have a tendency to wander if they aren't clamped down pretty firmly. This arrangement did the trick. I worked backwards and attached all of the stringers, opting for 12-inch centers for these both on the top and the bottom. After all the bottom stringers were installed, I ripped down a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood to lay on top. This does 2 things for me. It allowed me to square up the table before I put all of the top stringers. I was about 1/4 inch out of square when I measured diagonally. I put a clamp across 2 corners and tightened it up slightly until the table was perfectly square. I then put a screw in each corner of the bottom sheet to hold everything firmly in place. The other benefit to this plywood, while probably unnecessary, is that it will keep dust from the drawers I'm going to build inside the table. The top stretchers are very similar to the bottom with one small omission that catches up with me in a minute. I work backwards again, attaching the stringers with 2 pocket screws on each side. After I finish, it dawns on me that I need to attach the top to these stringers from the bottom. I thought about taking them all out and drilling the pocket holes, but I decided it would be better just to squeeze into the middle of the table and drill 3 more pocket holes in each stringer. This wasn't super pleasant, but I guess lesson learned? Probably not, but it's nice to think that I'll catch something like this in the future. After a pretty uncomfortable 10 minutes, the rest of the holes are drilled. My camera died on me when I was gluing up the top, so we don't get to watch that together here. Basically, I dumped a large amount of wood glue between 2 sheets of 3/4 inch MDF, lined them up, and fastened them together with a ton of cabinet screws. I never know how much glue to use with MDF, but I used a lot. I think I could probably have used a bit more. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but we'll see if it separates in the future. My bet is no. Once the top is glued together and cut down to size, I worked back and forth to get it perfectly centered on the table and exactly where I wanted it. Once done, it was back on the ground to fill in all those nice pocket holes I drilled with some fancy, expensive screws. My dismount here leaves something to be desired, but I thought I'd leave it in the video for us all to see how, in fact, 40 is not the new 20. As part of this build, I wanted to have a permanent home for my dust extractor under the wing of my table saw. I decided I would build one of those fancy Lincoln Street Woodworks dust boom arms and needed a way to get the power cable and the dust hose for my vacuum up to the arm. If you haven't seen his video, I highly recommend you check it out. He's a really talented woodworker, and this really is an impactful change you can make to your shop without too much effort. I've put a link to his video in the description below. Anyway, rather than measure out where I wanted the holes to go so that they wouldn't hit the table frame below, I decided I hadn't done enough calisthenics today, so I crawled back under and drilled some holes. Honestly, this sucked, and I should probably just have measured and drilled from the top. This seems to have worked out pretty well though, and it makes it very easy to route both the hose and the cord. Installing Formica countertops is pretty straightforward. I laid the Formica upside down on my table saw and applied a decently thick coat of contact cement to both the MDF and the Formica. I got more coverage area than the can suggests, but I don't think I could have gone any thicker without ending up with a goopy mess. Let me know in the comments if your experience is similar. I let it dry for around 30 or 40 minutes until it was dry to the touch. There were a couple of contact cement boogers that formed when I went back over an area that had already started to set up. I carefully picked these off, being careful not to peel back any of the contact cement. I then laid out a series of plywood scraps to lift the Formica off the MDF table. Contact cement bonds basically instantly when the two glued halves touch. These strips allow me to position the Formica so it's centered over the MDF, starting in the middle. I pulled them out and firmly press and roll the Formica. I have a cheap J-roller that works mostly okay. If I were doing this regularly, I would definitely invest in a higher quality, heavier roller. I then just work my way out towards the edges, pulling out the plywood spacers, pressing and rolling, and that's it. The Formica is now firmly glued in place. I ended up with a big overhang on one side of the Formica and decided it was a bit risky to try to attack this with a flush trim bit on my router. So I used my track saw to cut this closer to the table. I left a couple of inches overhang here. Next, I used a flush trim bit in my little Milwaukee trim router and worked all the way around the perimeter of the table. In the past, I've used a roundover or chamfer bit for this, but I wanted to maintain the square edge. I'm going to be applying some solid maple edge bending here and wanted as tight of a seam between the Formica and the maple as possible. I drilled a hole up through the holes I cut from my vacuum hose and power cord. I then used my trim router with a 1/8 inch roundover bit to flush up the Formica with the holes and to soften the edge. Nothing crazy here, no chipping or tear out, just nice smooth holes. Now it was time to cut the slots for the miter track. This is one of those scary, no mistakes allowed type situations. There's a lot of work and enough money in this tabletop that you really don't want to screw up here. I carefully marked out where I wanted the miter slot holes to be routed out. I lined up my crosscut sled and made sure to mark how far into the table I would need to go to get just past the center of the blade. This should give me enough room to push everything through. I used my Milwaukee trim router here with a plunge base and connected it to the track for my track saw. This provides a good reference to ensure that the cut is straight. Optionally, you can do this by sticking straight guide blocks to the table with double-sided tape or clamps. In the past, I've used a level for this and it worked out really well. I make about 3 passes and then move the bit over and repeat until I hit the width that I want for this slot. I want this slot to be a hair wider than the slots on the table saw to allow for a bit more variance in how they are lined up. Not much, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so wider on each side. After that, I move the track setup to the other side and repeat. After both are cut, I soften the edge with a 1/8 inch roundover bit. Honestly, this is one of the parts of this build that I'm the most excited for. With my last setup, the MDF was just high enough to interfere with the crosscut sled. I had to remember before I used it to slide the top back 6 inches. I often forgot and would have to either stop mid-cut or use the sled to push the MDF back. I had a couple of times where the tabletop tipped over with half-done projects on top. This was both dangerous and highly annoying. I'm glad that that's going to be a thing of the past. I used the little supplied 13mm wrench to adjust the feet. It took a bit of back and forth, but I was able to get it perfectly level. I had to shim under one corner of the table saw to get everything perfect, but in the end, it's nearly perfectly level with the saw. Boards slide back and forth without catching at all. Well, I think this is a good spot to leave this video. In the next video, I'm going to focus on installing my router lift, dust box, and Jestem master fence. There is nothing straightforward about modifying the Jestem fence to work with a table like this. If you like this build, make sure to subscribe and catch the next one. Thank you!